Please, don't tell anyone I'm here." That was all he said. 7 years old, 12 days alone in the Arizona desert, a grocery bag with everything he owned pressed against his chest like it was the last thing standing between him and nothing. And the man towering over him, 6'4", 300 pounds, a Hell's Angels patch on his chest, dropped to his knees on the pavement and felt something inside him crack wide open. Not because the boy was crying, because he wasn't. Because a child that small had already learned that begging didn't work. So he stopped begging, and 500 of the most feared men in America heard him anyway. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The night Ethan Walker said those words, he hadn't eaten a real meal in 2 days. Not a warm one anyway. He had learned, sometime around the 3rd or 4th night of living behind the Silver Mesa Diner, that if you waited long enough, past 10, sometimes 11, the cook would come out the back door and throw away whatever hadn't sold. Half a basket of fries, a burger with 1 bite taken out, sometimes a whole slice of pie, just because the crust had gone a little soft. Ethan always waited for the sound of that back door swinging open, that creak of rusted hinges. That was dinner. That was survival. He was 7 years old. What nobody knew, what nobody had bothered to find out, was that Ethan had been surviving like this for 12 days straight. 12 days of cardboard and desert cold and a grocery bag that held everything he owned in the world. An oversized blue t-shirt his mother had bought him at a gas station the summer before she got really sick. A flashlight with a cracked lens that flickered more than it shone, and a photograph. Just one photograph. His mother, Claire Walker, sitting on the hood of a red car Ethan didn't recognize, laughing at something outside the frame. Her hair was blowing sideways. She looked young. She looked like she had no idea what was coming. Ethan kept that photograph folded in the front pocket of his jeans, pressed against his hip, where he could feel it every time he moved. It was the only thing in the world that was still entirely his. Claire Walker had died in April. Leukemia, the kind that moves fast and doesn't apologize. She had fought it for 14 months, and Ethan had watched her fight it, watched her go from laughing on the hood of that red car to a hospital bed with tubes running into both arms. And through all of it, Claire had held his hand and told him the same thing every single night. "Baby, no matter what happens, somebody's going to take care of you. I promise you that." Ethan had believed her. He was 6 years old when she said it. 6 years old, and he still believed in his mother the way most kids believe in gravity. Not because they understand it, but because they've never known a world where it wasn't true. Then she was gone. And Ethan found out what happened to boys with no fathers and no relatives and no one to sign the paperwork. They went into the system. The first foster home wasn't bad, exactly. It was just empty. A couple in their 50s, a clean house in Phoenix, 2 other kids who had already learned to keep to themselves. The man watched television, the woman made sandwiches. Nobody was cruel. Nobody was kind either. It was like living inside a waiting room. Everything functional, nothing warm. Ethan lasted 6 weeks there before the placement ended for reasons that were never fully explained to him. One day there was a social worker at the door. The next day he was somewhere else. The second home was different. The second home had a lock on the bedroom door. Not a lock you could open from the inside, a lock on the outside, a bolt that slid into place after lights out, so the children couldn't wander. That was how the foster mother explained it. So you don't wander. Ethan had never wandered in his life. He was a quiet kid. He read books. He kept his shoes lined up straight. But every night when that bolt slid home and the light went out and he was sealed inside that room with the window that didn't open all the way, something happened inside him that he didn't have a word for. It felt like being buried. It felt like his mother's hospital room that last week when the machines breathed for her. It felt like the end of something. He lasted 8 days. On the 9th morning, When the bolt slid back and the foster mother opened the door, Ethan walked past her with his grocery bag already packed, walked down the hallway, walked out the front door, and didn't stop walking for 4 hours. He was done. If the world wanted him to disappear, he would disappear on his own terms. He had ended up in Ridgeline, Arizona, if you could call it ending up anywhere, since Ridgeline was barely a dot on a gas station map, because he had hitched a ride on the back of a vegetable truck whose driver hadn't noticed him climb aboard, and Ridgeline was where the truck stopped. The Silver Mesa Diner sat at the intersection of two highways that didn't lead anywhere particularly important. Truckers stopped there. Travelers stopped there. Nobody stayed. Except Ethan. He had found the gap between the dumpster and the back wall, just wide enough for a small boy with a grocery bag, and something about it felt, if not safe, at least defensible. Hidden. A place where no one would think to look. For 12 days, no one did. On the 12th night, the desert started shaking. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A low vibration that moved through the ground and up through the cardboard and into his bones. He thought, in the half-asleep space between dreaming and waking, that it was an earthquake. He had read about Arizona earthquakes in a library book once. He had read about a lot of things in library books. Then the sound hit. Not one engine, not 10, hundreds. A roar that filled the whole sky, that seemed to come from everywhere at once, that grew and grew until the air itself seemed to compress under the weight of it. Ethan pressed himself flat against the wall. Headlights swept across the parking lot. He could see the edges of their light from where he crouched, long bars of white cutting through the dark. And the sound was enormous, the kind of sound that belonged to something that didn't stop for anything. And then slowly it did stop. 500 engines, cutting out one by one, until all that was left was the ticking of cooling metal and the distant whistle of desert wind. Ethan didn't move. He barely breathed. He pulled his grocery bag against his chest like a shield and made himself as small as a 7-year-old boy could make himself. And he waited. He heard boots on pavement. A lot of boots. The murmur of men's voices, low and rough. Laughter occasionally, the big genuine kind that didn't have anything sharp in it. The diner's back door opened. Light flooded the narrow space for just a second, and Ethan pressed himself harder into the wall. Footsteps came around the corner. One set, heavy, slow. And then a man filled the space between the wall and the dumpster. He was enormous. That was the first thing Ethan registered. Not fat, but big in the way that certain men are big. Built like something that had been put together with extra materials. His shoulders wide enough that he had to turn slightly to fit through the gap. He wore a leather vest over a black t-shirt, and the vest had patches on it, and the patches had a name. The man stopped. He looked down. Ethan looked up. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved. Then the man crouched down, slowly, deliberately, the way you'd crouch near a dog you weren't sure about. And his ice-blue eyes were level with Ethan's, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than anything Ethan expected from a man that size. "Hey, kid." Ethan's whole body was shaking. He could feel it in his hands. He couldn't make it stop. The man looked at the cardboard, looked at the grocery bag, looked at Ethan's face, the sunburn on his cheeks, the way his hair had gone rough and unwashed, the shadows under his eyes that a 7-year-old shouldn't have. Something moved across the man's face, something that didn't match the leather and the tattoos and the 300 pounds of road-hardened muscle. Something that looked, Ethan thought, almost like pain. "How long you been back here?" the man asked. Ethan said nothing. The man waited. He was patient in a way that surprised Ethan, who had expected to be grabbed or yelled at or dragged back to a social worker's car. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said. "I'm not going to call anybody, He stopped, tried again. "I just need to know you're okay." Ethan swallowed. "Just a while," he said. The man's name was Marcus Hayes. Most people called him Iron Hawk, a road name he'd earned at 23 on a stretch of highway in New Mexico that he didn't talk about much. He was the president of the Arizona chapter, which meant that the 500 men currently filling the Silver Mesa Diner's parking lot were, technically, his responsibility. Marcus had seen a lot of things in 30 years on the road. He had been arrested twice and acquitted both times. He had buried brothers. He had attended funerals where the whole chapter rode in a line so long it stopped traffic for 6 miles. He had seen hard things and done hard things, and lived a life that most people would describe, charitably, as complicated. But he had never seen a child's bed made of cardboard behind a dumpster before. And something about seeing it, something about the specific flatness of that cardboard, the specific way it had been laid out so deliberately, so carefully, the grocery bag tucked against the wall within arm's reach, hit Marcus Hayes somewhere deep and unprotected, somewhere he hadn't known was still soft. He sat down on the pavement, not crouched, sat, cross-legged on the ground, his back against the wall, 6 feet from Ethan, so that he was no longer towering and no longer looming, and no longer anything except a man sitting on the ground in the dark. "You hungry?" Marcus asked. Ethan hesitated. "I could eat," he said finally. Marcus almost smiled. There was something in the way the kid said it, not "yes, please" or "I'm starving," or the kind of desperate gratitude Marcus might have expected from a child who was clearly half-starved. Just, "I could eat." Measured, careful, like he was trying not to want too much. That right there told Marcus more about this kid's last few months than anything else could have. "Sit tight," Marcus said. He stood, unfolding himself from the pavement. "I'll be right back." He came back with a cheeseburger, fries, a chocolate milkshake, and a man named Lucas Carter. Lucas Ghost Carter was a contradiction in terms. 6'2", built like a linebacker, with a scar along his jaw from a bar fight in Tucson in 2009, and hands that had broken enough bones to require 3 separate surgeries. He was also, somehow, the gentlest person Marcus had ever met. The kind of man who stopped to move turtles off highways. The kind of man who remembered every birthday. He was also a former Marine and a former foster kid, which meant he understood 2 things simultaneously: how to survive in impossible situations and what it felt like to be a child that nobody came for. When Marcus brought him around the corner and Lucas saw Ethan for the first time, saw the cardboard bed and the grocery bag and the kid sitting with his knees pulled up, eyes wary, body poised to run, Lucas went completely still. Then he sat down on the ground next to Marcus, same as Marcus had, without saying a word. Because he understood instinctively that the worst thing you could do right now was loom. Ethan looked at both of them. Then he looked at the milkshake. "That's for you," Marcus said. "No conditions." Ethan took it. He drank half of it before he seemed to remember that he was supposed to be careful, and then he slowed down and took small sips, like he was rationing something that might disappear. "What's your name?" Lucas asked. A pause. Then, "Ethan." "Ethan, I'm Lucas." He paused. "You know what I did before I was riding bikes?" Ethan shook his head. "Marines, 10 years. Another pause. "And before that, when I was about your age, maybe a year or 2 older, I was in foster care." Ethan stopped drinking. He looked at Lucas. "How many homes?" Ethan asked. It was the question of someone who already knew the landscape. Lucas met his eyes. 7, he said. Something shifted in Ethan's face. Something guarded became something slightly less guarded. 4 for me, Ethan said quietly. 2 real ones and then 2 that weren't. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Marcus said carefully, "You want to tell us what happened?" And Ethan told them. Not all of it at once. He wasn't built that way, didn't trust that way, had learned too recently and too hard that trusting adults led to locked bedroom doors and social workers at the front door and everything you had left crammed back into a grocery bag while someone who didn't know your name drove you somewhere new. But he told them pieces. His mother's name was Claire. She died in April. She had told him someone would take care of him. He had believed her for a long time. The first home was fine, but empty. The second home had a lock on the bedroom door. He couldn't tell them what the third home was like without his voice doing something he didn't want it to do. So he skipped it. The fourth home, the last one, had been okay for about 2 weeks. And then it hadn't been, and he'd left. He'd found the truck. He'd found the diner. He'd found the gap behind the dumpster. 12 days? Marcus said. Yeah. By yourself? I'm pretty good at being by myself, Ethan said. And the way he said it, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of flat, accepting practicality, made both men go quiet. Lucas looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Lucas. The kind of look that doesn't need words. Marcus excused himself. He walked back around the corner, back to the parking lot, where 500 bikers were still milling around the diner, in the lot, and the road beyond. He found his inner circle, the men he'd ridden with long enough that they knew each other by the weight of silence, as much as by speech. He told them what was behind the dumpster. The first man he told was a mechanic from Flagstaff named Ray, who had 6 grandchildren and a reputation for never showing emotion. Ray listened to the whole thing, jaw working slowly, and then said, "How old?" 7. Ray turned around and walked back to his bike. He stood there with his back to Marcus for a long moment. When he turned back, his eyes were red. "What do we do?" Ray asked. "I don't know yet," Marcus said, "but we don't leave him there." Word moved through the parking lot the way it always moved through the Brotherhood. Fast, quiet, person to person, a chain reaction of information that traveled in low voices and came out the other end as something solid, something decided. One by one, men drifted around the corner of the diner. Not all 500, the space wasn't big enough for 500, but 20, then 30, then more, standing in the shadows near the dumpster, looking at the small blonde boy eating a cheeseburger on a piece of cardboard. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke too loud. Nobody did anything except stand there and look, and then feel whatever it was they needed to feel, and then quietly, carefully, make their way back to the parking lot with that feeling carried inside them like something heavy and important. Because the boy with the grocery bag and the broken flashlight and the photograph of his dead mother hadn't just needed food and a stranger's kindness. He had needed to be seen. At some point, Ethan couldn't track time reliably anymore. The desert nights all ran together. Marcus came back with a blanket. An actual blanket, not a jacket, not a tarp, but a proper blanket that smelled like laundry and the open road. "You don't have to talk anymore," Marcus said, handing it over. "You don't have to do anything. Just rest." Ethan took the blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. It was enormous on him. "You're not going to call anyone?" Ethan asked. Marcus thought about that. He thought about what honest meant and what kind meant and whether they were the same thing here. "Not tonight," he said finally. "Tonight you sleep." Ethan looked at him for a long time. "Why are you being nice to me?" he asked. It wasn't an innocent question. It wasn't the question of a child who had grown up in safety, who took kindness as a given. It was the question of a child who had learned, recently, specifically, at a cost, that kindness from adults was usually the beginning of a transaction. Marcus sat with that question for a moment. "Because you needed it," he said. "That's the whole reason." Ethan stared at him. Then he pulled the blanket tighter and lay down on the cardboard. And he was asleep in under 3 minutes. Marcus stayed until he was sure the boy was under deep. Then he stood and walked back to the lot. And when he found Lucas leaning against his bike with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, Marcus said the only thing that mattered: "We're not leaving him here." Lucas nodded once. "No," he said, "we're not." They just didn't know yet what staying was going to cost them, or how far 500 men would go for one boy who only asked to be left alone. Marcus Hayes had not slept in 31 hours by the time the sun came up over the Arizona desert. He sat on an overturned milk crate outside the diner's back door. a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, listening to the sound of Ethan's breathing from around the corner. Slow, even. The breathing of a child who had finally let his guard down. Lucas sat across from him on the pavement, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing. "You know we can't just take him," Lucas said quietly. "Not an argument, a statement of reality." "I know. Social services, courts, the whole machine." "I know that too." Lucas looked up. "So what are you thinking?" Marcus turned the cold coffee cup in his hands. "I'm thinking that a 7-year-old boy just told me that every adult who was supposed to protect him locked him in a room instead." He set the cup down. "And I'm thinking that I've got 500 brothers out in that parking lot who rode all night and haven't asked for a single thing." He paused. "And I'm thinking that maybe the machine works different when 500 people are pushing it in the same direction." Lucas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's either the smartest thing you've ever said or the most dangerous." "Probably both," Marcus said. That was when the back door opened and Linda Brooks stepped out. Linda ran the Silver Mesa Diner the way certain women run certain places, with absolute authority and zero patience for nonsense. She was 54, blonde going gray at the temples, and she had seen enough highway life pass through her counterstools that she thought nothing surprised her anymore. She had watched the whole parking lot fill up the night before with the kind of controlled chaos that only large groups of disciplined people can produce. And she had kept her diner open an extra 3 hours and fed every one of them without complaint and without fear. She was that kind of woman. She came around the corner with a plate of eggs, toast, and a glass of orange juice, looked at Ethan, still asleep on the cardboard, and then looked at Marcus. "How old?" she asked. 7. She absorbed that, set the plate down carefully near the sleeping boy without waking him, straightened up, crossed her arms. "His mother?" she asked. "Gone. April." "Father?" "No father on record." Linda pressed her lips together. She looked at Ethan's grocery bag against the wall. She looked at the broken flashlight lying next to it. She stood there for a long time without speaking, and Marcus watched something move through her face that he recognized because he'd felt it himself less than 6 hours ago. The specific weight of understanding what a child's life had been reduced to. "He's been eating out of my trash," she said finally, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, slowly, like she was agreeing to something bigger than the sentence itself. Then she turned and walked back inside without another word. Marcus and Lucas exchanged a look. "What does that mean?" Lucas asked. "I have no idea," Marcus said, "but I don't think it means nothing." Ethan woke up 20 minutes later. He woke up the way kids who've been sleeping rough learn to wake up. Fast, eyes open, body already tense before his brain caught up. He sat up straight on the cardboard and looked around. And for just a second, Marcus saw the exact moment the boy remembered where he was and who was sitting nearby. Saw the tension in his small shoulders decide which direction to go, toward fear or toward something cautiously less than fear. It went toward cautiously less than fear. "Morning," Marcus said. Ethan looked at the plate of eggs, looked at Marcus. "She know I'm here?" he asked. "Linda? Yeah, she made you breakfast." Ethan picked up the fork slowly, like he was waiting for the catch. When no catch came, he started eating, carefully at first, then faster, the way hunger always wins eventually over caution. Marcus let him eat, didn't talk, didn't push. It was Lucas who finally said, quietly, "Ethan, we need to talk about what comes next." The fork stopped moving. "I'm not going back," Ethan said. Not loud, not panicked, just absolute. The kind of absolute that comes from having already made the decision so many times it's become part of your bones. "I hear you," Lucas said. "I'm not saying you go back to where you were. I'm saying we have to figure out something that isn't a dumpster." "The dumpster's fine." "The dumpster is not fine," Marcus said, and something in his voice made Ethan look up. "You're 7 years old, kid. It is not fine." A silence stretched between them. Then Ethan said something that hit Marcus like a closed fist to the chest. "Nobody's gonna want me," he said. "I already know that. I'm not trying to be sad about it. It's just true. Kids like me, the ones who run, the ones who have problems, nobody picks us. We just go from place to place until we're 18, and then we're not anyone's problem anymore." He looked back at his eggs. "I figured out I'd rather be nobody's problem now." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. Lucas got there first. "You know how I know that's wrong?" Lucas said. Ethan didn't answer. "Because I said the exact same thing when I was 9 years old. Word for word, kid. I said it to a social worker who just told me my 6th placement wasn't working out." He paused. "And I was wrong." Ethan looked at him sideways. "What happened?" Eventually, the right person showed up. Lucas's voice stayed even, but his jaw was working. Took too long, hurt too much getting there, but they showed up. Ethan stared at him for a long time with those two old eyes. "You really believe that?" he asked. "I'm sitting here, aren't I?" Lucas said. The back door swung open again. Linda Brooks came back out, this time without a plate, without anything in her hands, and Marcus noticed immediately that she'd been crying. Not currently crying, had been. Her eyes were dry now, but the traces were there. And Linda Brooks did not seem like a woman who cried easily. She looked at Ethan. "You know I've been running this diner for 22 years, she said. Ethan looked up at her warily. "My husband built it," she continued, "passed 8 years ago. My daughter moved to Portland. My son—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I've got a 3-bedroom house 6 miles down the road that I rattle around in by myself." She crouched down, same as Marcus had the night before, getting herself level with the boy. "I'm not a warm, fuzzy person. I won't pretend otherwise. I swear sometimes. I'm strict about chores. I make you eat vegetables even when you don't want to." Ethan was completely still. "But I have never in my life," Linda said, "let anyone sleep behind my dumpster when there was a bed available. And I'm not starting now." The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear the highway. "You don't know me," Ethan said. "No," Linda agreed. "Not yet. I run sometimes." "I figured." "I don't—" Ethan's voice snagged on something. He pushed through it. "I don't always trust people right away." "That's the smartest thing you've said so far," Linda said. Something in Ethan's face cracked open just slightly. Not all the way. Not enough to call it hope, exactly, but enough to call it the beginning of considering hope. "What's the catch?" he asked. Linda looked him straight in the eye. "No catch. You eat, you sleep, you go to school. That's it." The boy looked at Marcus. Marcus nodded once. And then Ethan Walker, who had not cried in front of another person since his mother's funeral, pressed the back of his wrist hard against his mouth and looked at the ground and breathed through his nose 3 times, working very hard at something that he almost lost. He didn't cry, but it was close. Then the sound cut through everything. A sharp, authoritative crunch of gravel, headlights sweeping the back lot, a door slamming, a sheriff's cruiser. Sheriff Daniel Reeves of Ridgeline County was 38 years old, and he had received the call at 6:47 that morning from a trucker who'd stopped at the Silver Mesa and reported, his words, a small child surrounded by about 1,000 bikers. The number was wrong. The concern wasn't. Daniel had driven out expecting the worst. He had a rough working knowledge of what motorcycle clubs meant in terms of jurisdiction and probable cause, and he had prepared himself during the 8-mile drive for something that would require backup. He had not prepared for what he actually found. He came around the corner with his hand near his belt, the automatic posture of a man who'd been a cop for 12 years, and then he stopped. A small blond boy sat on a piece of cardboard eating eggs. 2 of the largest men Daniel had ever seen sat on either side of him, not hovering, not pressing, just sitting, present, and the boy was eating with the focused determination of someone who'd been hungry for a long time. Daniel took his hand away from his belt. "Morning," Marcus said, looking up. His voice was even, no aggression, no performance. Daniel looked at the child. "This the boy?" "This is Ethan," Marcus said. The use of the name was deliberate, Daniel noticed. Not the kid, not the child, a name. Daniel crouched down. He'd done this before. The approach, the crouch, the careful voice. He was good with kids. His own daughter was 9. "Hey, Ethan, I'm Sheriff Reeves. Are you hurt at all?" Ethan looked at him with an expression Daniel would remember for years. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of exhausted, preemptive grief, like a kid who already knew what came after the kind voice. "I'm okay," Ethan said. "How long have you been here?" 12 days, Marcus answered. Daniel looked at him sharply. Marcus met his eyes. "We found him last night. He's been surviving on food from the diner trash." Daniel absorbed this, looked at the cardboard, looked at the grocery bag. "Ethan," he said carefully, "I need to understand your situation. Can you tell me, are you sending me back?" Ethan asked. The question was direct, no preamble, no softening, just the question, dropped like something heavy into the space between them. Daniel opened his mouth. Then he made a decision that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with the expression on that 7-year-old boy's face. "Not today," he said. Marcus behind him let out a breath. Linda appeared at the back door. She looked at Daniel Reeves with the particular look she reserved for people she wasn't sure about yet. "Dan," she said. They apparently knew each other. "Linda," he said. Then, after a pause, "You want to tell me what's going on here?" "I'm going to apply for emergency guardianship," she said, like it was the most natural sentence she'd ever spoken, like she'd been thinking it for 20 years instead of 20 minutes. "For the boy. I'm assuming that means paperwork, so tell me what I need and I'll start this morning." Daniel stood up slowly. He looked at Linda. He looked at the 2 massive bikers. He looked at the small boy on the cardboard who was watching all of this with the careful attention of someone who had learned that adult conversations determined the weather of his life. "Linda," Daniel said carefully, "do you understand what the process involves?" "I run a business, Dan. I understand processes. Background checks, home inspections, court dates. Clear conscience, clean house, free calendar," she said. "Next question." A beat of silence. Then Daniel Reeves did something unexpected. He took off his hat, ran his hand through his hair, put the hat back on, and looked at Ethan. "Ethan," he said, "what do you want?" Nobody had asked him that before. Not once. Not the social workers, not the foster families, not the placement coordinators who had moved him around like a file that needed to be in a different cabinet. Not one adult in the months since his mother died had looked at him and asked what he wanted. Ethan looked at Linda, then at Marcus, then at Lucas, then back at Daniel. "I want to stay," he said. It was barely a whisper, but Daniel Reeves heard it like a shout. He reached for his radio. What happened next moved fast. The way things sometimes move when the right people decide that the usual pace isn't acceptable. Daniel Reeves called his cousin, who was a family court clerk. Marcus called the club's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Okafor in Phoenix, who had handled their legal affairs for 15 years, and who, when Marcus explained the situation in 4 sentences, said without hesitation, "I'm driving there now." By 10 in the morning, there were 5 people around Linda's kitchen table. Linda, Marcus, Lucas, Patricia on speakerphone, and Daniel Reeves with a yellow legal pad, working through the first steps of emergency guardianship like it was a mission brief. Ethan sat in the corner of the kitchen, on a real chair, at a real table, drinking real orange juice. He wasn't part of the conversation, but he was watching it. And slowly, almost invisibly, the set of his shoulders began to change. And in the parking lot, the 500 men who had slept in shifts and hadn't left, because no one had told them to leave and because none of them had wanted to, waited for word. Patricia Okafor arrived at the Silver Mesa Diner at 11:47 in the morning, drove past 200 motorcycles parked along the highway shoulder without blinking, walked into Linda's kitchen with a leather briefcase and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and said, "All right, who has the child's documentation?" Everyone looked at each other. "Right," Patricia said. "So we start from scratch." "That's fine. I've done it before." She set her briefcase on the table, popped it open, and looked at Ethan sitting in the corner. She didn't baby talk him, didn't soften her voice into something artificially sweet. She just looked at him directly and said, "You're Ethan." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I'm going to get you a home, a legal one. It's going to take paperwork and time, and it's going to require everyone in this room to do exactly what I say when I say it. Can you wait on that?" Ethan looked at her for a moment. "How much time?" "Weeks, maybe a month. Emergency guardianship moves faster than standard adoption, but it still moves through courts, and courts don't run on anyone's schedule but their own." She held his gaze. "But I promise you this, I have never lost an emergency guardianship case where the child had a stable adult willing to step up in a clean placement environment. Not once in 22 years. Ethan was quiet. Then he asked, "What happens to me while you're doing the paperwork?" Patricia looked at Linda. Linda looked at Daniel Reeves. Daniel cleared his throat. "Technically, I should be calling Child Protective Services right now." "Then why aren't you?" Marcus asked. His voice was level, but the question had weight. Daniel set down his pen. "Because I've made calls like that before, and I know what happens after. The kid goes into emergency placement, which means a stranger's house, which means starting over." He looked at Ethan. "And I'm looking at a boy who's already started over more times than most adults handle in a lifetime." He paused. "So what I'm going to do is document that the child is in the temporary care of Linda Brooks, a known and established member of this community, pending emergency guardianship proceedings, and I'm going to file that paperwork myself this afternoon." The kitchen was completely quiet. Patricia Okafor looked at Daniel Reeves with something that might have been respect. "You're sticking your neck out," she said. "Yeah," Daniel said simply. "I know." Ethan had been watching all of this from his corner. Now he looked at Linda and said, very quietly, "You sure about this? You don't have to do this." Linda turned to face him fully. "Ethan, let me tell you something about the kind of person I am. I don't do things I'm not sure about. I haven't got the patience for it." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm sure." And just like that, for the first time in months, Ethan Walker had somewhere to sleep that wasn't cardboard. But the story wasn't close to over, because outside in that parking lot, something else entirely was building. Ray Kowalski, the mechanic from Flagstaff with 6 grandchildren and red eyes, had gone back to his bike after hearing about Ethan and sat there for 45 minutes without speaking to anyone. Then he walked back to where the inner circle had gathered near the diner entrance and said, "We need to do more than emotional support." Marcus had been expecting this. "What are you thinking?" "Money," Ray said. "Practical stuff. Kid's got a grocery bag for luggage. Linda's house is decent, but it's been just her for 8 years. And legal fees." He looked at Patricia's car. "She's not cheap." "She's doing it pro bono," Marcus said. "Legal fees aren't the only cost," Ray said. "School clothes, school supplies, a bed that belongs to him, things that make a place feel like it's actually his." He crossed his arms. "I want to pass the bag." Within 10 minutes, Lucas had gone back inside to grab a saddlebag from his bike and carried it back out to the parking lot. He set it down on the seat of Ray's bike and looked at the crowd. He didn't give a speech. Lucas Carter was not a speech-giving man. He said 4 words. "Bags open. For Ethan." That was enough. The first man to step up was a retired ironworker from Tucson named Big Dom, who had $300 in his wallet and put in $250 without hesitation. Behind him came a younger rider, 24 years old, who had $40 total to his name and put in $30. Then a man in his 60s with silver hair and a Vietnam veteran's patch on his vest, who put in a check without writing the amount yet, then leaned over and asked Ray, "What's the most we could realistically use?" Ray told him, and the man filled in the number without flinching. Marcus stood near the diner door and watched it happen, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, something larger than pride and quieter than pride. Something that felt like what a brotherhood was supposed to be before it became legend and reputation and fear. In 22 minutes, the bag held $43,000. Ray zipped it up, looked at it, then looked at Marcus. "We're not done," he said. They passed it again. By the time the last man had stepped forward, by the time the riders from New Mexico and the ones from Nevada and the ones who'd driven 18 hours through the night had all had their turn, the total was $61,480. Marcus stood in the middle of the parking lot holding a saddlebag that weighed more than most people's monthly rent and thought about a grocery bag that weighed almost nothing. He went inside and set it on Linda's kitchen table. Linda stared at it. "What is that?" she asked. "For Ethan," Marcus said. "For whatever he needs, school, clothes, legal costs, the house, anything." Linda opened the bag, looked in, closed it again. She pressed one hand flat on top of it and looked at the table for a long moment, and her jaw was tight and her eyes were doing something she clearly didn't want them to do. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah? You tell those men," she stopped, started again. "You tell those men thank you. From him and from me." Ethan had been watching from the doorway. He'd seen Marcus carry the bag in. He'd seen Linda open it. He had no context for what $60,000 looked like in a saddlebag, but he understood the weight of the moment even without the number. He walked over to the table slowly and looked up at Marcus. "That's for me?" "For your life," Marcus said. "Whatever you need to build it." Ethan put his hand on top of Linda's hand, which was still flat on the bag. Just rested it there. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't ask for this." "No," Marcus said. "That's exactly why you get it." The afternoon should have been the beginning of something smooth. It wasn't. At 2:15, Patricia Okafor's phone rang. She listened for 90 seconds, said, "Hold on," without inflection, and walked out the back door. Marcus, who had been sitting across the table reviewing paperwork, watched her face through the window. He'd known Patricia for 15 years. She was not a woman who alarmed easily. She looked alarmed. She came back inside and sat down and folded her hands on the table and said, without preamble, "Ethan's third foster family has filed a report. They're claiming he stole from them before he left." The kitchen went completely still. "What?" Linda said. "Personal property, they're alleging. Cash, specifically. They're claiming $200 went missing the day Ethan left, and they believe he took it." Patricia kept her voice neutral, professional, but her eyes were hard. "It's almost certainly retaliatory. Filed this morning, which means they found out somehow that proceedings are being initiated." She paused. "It complicates things. Any pending allegation against a child in a guardianship proceeding has to be investigated before the court moves forward." "He's 7, Lucas said from the doorway. His voice was very quiet and very controlled. "He's 7 years old and they're filing theft charges." "They're not charges, it's a report, but it triggers a review." Patricia looked at Ethan. He had heard everything. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat in front of him and his face carefully blank. The particular blankness of a child who has learned that showing emotion in adult conversations sometimes makes things worse. "Ethan," Patricia said gently, "did you take anything from that house when you left?" "No," he said. Okay, she nodded once. I believe you. But I need you to tell me everything you remember about that house. Every detail, because we're going to need to build a counter-narrative, and we need to start now. Ethan looked down at his hands. Then he looked up. They had a camera, he said, in the hallway, one of those little ones you plug into the wall. I noticed it my second day there. Patricia went very still. A security camera? Yeah, covering the hallway and the front door. Patricia uncapped her pen. You're sure about this? I remember everything about places I don't feel safe, Ethan said. I've gotten real good at it. There was a heavy silence in the kitchen. Marcus looked at Lucas. Lucas's jaw was working. Patricia was already writing. If that footage exists and hasn't been deleted, it either shows you leaving with something or it shows you leaving with just a grocery bag. She looked at Ethan. Which one is it going to show? I had my bag, Ethan said. That's it. I didn't even take the toothbrush they gave me because it wasn't mine. Patricia was already reaching for her phone. Daniel Reeves, who had been quietly reviewing his own paperwork in the corner, stood up and put on his hat. I'll make the call to the department that has jurisdiction, he said, requesting preservation of that footage before it gets conveniently lost. He looked at Marcus. You didn't hear me say that. Hear what? Marcus said. Daniel was out the door in 30 seconds. The next 2 hours were the hardest. Ethan sat at the kitchen table while adults moved around him with phones and papers and conversations that were about him, but rarely with him. And he did what he had learned to do in difficult waiting. He went somewhere quiet inside himself. He thought about his mother. He thought about her in the red car with her hair blowing sideways, laughing at something outside the frame. He thought about what she'd told him. Somebody's going to take care of you, baby. I promise you that. He had been so angry at her for that promise. Angry the way you can only be angry at people you've loved completely, furious and tender at the same time, because she'd been wrong, and she'd been wrong from a place of love, and those two things couldn't coexist without tearing something. But sitting at Linda Brooks's kitchen table with $60,000 in a saddlebag and a lawyer on the phone and a sheriff pulling footage and two massive bikers who hadn't left his side since last night, Ethan thought maybe his mother hadn't been wrong. Maybe she'd just been early. Lucas sat down across from him around the 4 o'clock mark, when the kitchen had emptied briefly. He didn't bring any papers. He just sat. You okay? Lucas asked. I've been worse, Ethan said. That's not the same as okay. No, Ethan agreed. It's not. Lucas looked at the table. You know what the hardest part of being in care was? For me? Not the bad placements, not the moving around. He paused. It was the way it made me feel like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be known. He looked up. You're not a problem, Ethan. You're a person. And the people in this building are here because they know the difference. Ethan looked at him for a long time. Why do you care so much? Ethan asked. You just met me. Yeah, Lucas said, but I've been you. He leaned back. And nobody came for me the way we came for you. And that's not self-pity, I'm past that. It's just that when you get the chance to be the person that shows up, you show up, because you know what it costs when nobody does. The kitchen door opened. Patricia walked back in. Her face had changed. The hard edges were still there, but something else was in it now, something compressed and purposeful. They have the footage, she said, 48 hours of it. Daniel's department has already submitted the preservation request. She pulled her chair out and sat. And here's the interesting part. The camera in that hallway? It wasn't just in the hallway. It covered the foster parents' bedroom door. She opened her laptop. And I just got a call from a family lawyer in Phoenix who says she has 3 previous foster children from that same home who have been waiting for exactly this kind of moment to come forward. Marcus, who had come back in behind her, stopped moving. 3 kids, he said. 3 former placements, all with similar stories. Patricia looked over her glasses. The theft allegation against Ethan just became the least of that family's problems. The room absorbed this. Then Linda Brooks, who had been standing at the counter with her arms crossed through all of it, said very quietly, "So it wasn't just him." "No," Patricia said, "it was not just him." And Ethan Walker, who had survived 12 nights behind a dumpster and 4 foster homes, and the death of the only person who had ever loved him unconditionally, pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Because the thing that had happened in that third house, the thing he hadn't been able to tell Marcus and Lucas about without his voice breaking, the thing he'd skipped over in his own telling of his story, was no longer just his to carry. Marcus looked at him from across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just nodded once. And Ethan nodded back. The footage from the third foster home arrived at Patricia Okafor's email at 6:47 that evening, forwarded by Daniel Reeves with a single line of text. "You're going to want to watch this start to finish." Patricia watched it alone in Linda's living room with the door closed. She was in there for 22 minutes. When she came out, her expression was the kind that experienced lawyers wear when they've seen something that confirms every worst assumption, and they need 30 seconds before they can speak professionally about it. Marcus was waiting in the hallway. "How bad?" he asked. Patricia looked at him over her glasses. "The theft allegation is gone. There's clear footage of Ethan leaving with 1 grocery bag and nothing else." She paused. "But what the footage also shows, over 4 days of recording, is enough for the Phoenix family lawyer to file a formal complaint with the state licensing board by morning." She folded her hands in front of her. "That foster home is finished, and Ethan is not the only child they hurt." Marcus stood very still. "Does Ethan know what's on that footage?" he asked. "He lived it," Patricia said quietly. "He already knows." Marcus turned and walked back to the kitchen, where Ethan was sitting at the table across from Linda, eating leftover pie and not talking. It was the kind of silence that 2 people share when they've already run out of careful words and have moved into something more honest. Just presence, just proximity, just the simple fact of not being alone. Marcus sat down. He didn't announce what Patricia had found. He didn't make it a moment. He just said, "You're clear, kid. The footage proves it." Ethan kept eating for another 2 bites. Then he set his fork down very carefully. "I told you I didn't take anything," he said. "I know you did." "Did you believe me?" Ethan asked. He wasn't being confrontational. He was asking something real, something that mattered to him in a specific and practical way. Because believing someone is different from verifying them, and Ethan Walker had been verified enough times. He wanted to know if he'd been believed. Marcus met his eyes. "First word out of your mouth. Yeah, I believed you." Something in Ethan's face shifted almost imperceptibly. He picked his fork back up. "Okay," he said. Linda across the table reached over and refilled his milk without comment. It was such a small and automatic gesture. The gesture of someone who had started, without realizing it, to treat this boy as someone who lived here, that neither she nor Marcus drew attention to it. But Ethan noticed. He noticed everything. The next morning came fast and complicated. Patricia had filed the emergency guardianship petition with the family court in Phoenix at 8 a.m. By 9:30, she had a call back from the court clerk, Daniel's cousin, telling her the petition had been assigned to Judge Carol Whitmore, who was known in family law circles as thorough, fair, and extraordinarily difficult to rush. Patricia relayed this to the kitchen table. "How long does thorough and fair take?" Marcus asked. "Normally, 60 to 90 days. She held up a hand before anyone could react. "But we have 3 things working in our favor. 1, the child has no safe existing placement and has been living rough, which supports urgent action. 2, the licensing complaint against the third foster home is already moving, which validates the reason he ran. 3, she looked at Daniel, who had come back for the morning briefing. Daniel has agreed to write a personal letter of support to the judge. A sheriff's endorsement in a guardianship case is not nothing. Daniel nodded. Already drafted it, he said. Marcus looked at him. I thought you said you needed to be careful about your neck. I said I was sticking it out, Daniel said. Didn't say I was being careful about it. Lucas, from the counter where he'd been drinking coffee for the past hour, made a sound that in a quieter man would have been a laugh. But the complication arrived not from the courts. It arrived from a social worker. Her name was Janet Hess, and she knocked on Linda's front door at 10:15 with a clipboard and the particular expression of someone who believes they are doing their job correctly and resents any implication otherwise. She was 40, precise, by the book in the way that books become a shield, and she had been called by the state after Daniel's formal documentation of Ethan's situation triggered an automatic oversight review. Linda answered the door. Janet Hess introduced herself. Linda let her in without warmth. Ethan was in the kitchen. He heard the knock, heard the introduction, heard the word social services, and went completely still in the way that prey animals go still. Not invisible, just waiting, calculating. Marcus was at the table. He looked at Ethan. He mouthed, "Stay." Ethan stayed. Janet Hess came into the kitchen, looked around, looked at Marcus, at his leather vest, his road-worn hands, the patches, and something tightened in her face that she didn't quite manage to neutralize. "I'm here to assess the current situation," she said. "Standard procedure following an unofficial placement documentation." "Patricia Okafor is our attorney," Marcus said. "She's available by phone if you have procedural questions." "I have questions for the child," Janet said. "That's fine," Marcus said, "but she should be on the phone while you ask them." Janet looked at him with the look of someone who does not like being managed. "This is a routine welfare check, not a legal proceeding." "Then it shouldn't be a problem to have legal counsel available," Marcus said, with the same even calm he'd used the night before with Daniel Reeves. No heat, no apology, just a wall that happened to sound polite. Janet Hess set her clipboard down on the kitchen table and looked at Ethan directly. "How are you feeling, Ethan?" Ethan looked at her. "Fine," he said. "Are you comfortable here?" "Yes." "Do you feel safe?" Ethan looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "More than I have in a while," he said. Janet made a note. "And you've been here how long?" "Since last night," Linda answered from the doorway. "I was asking Ethan," Janet said. "Since last night," Ethan confirmed. Janet looked around the kitchen again, at Marcus, at Lucas near the back door, at the coffee cups and the paperwork spread across the table. Her eyes went back to Marcus's vest. "Is this a regular gathering of friends?" Marcus said. "Yes." The word landed flat and certain. Not a challenge, a correction. Janet made another note and then said, very carefully, "I want to make clear that while I appreciate everyone's concern for this child, the formal placement process exists to protect him. And part of my assessment today includes evaluating whether this current arrangement meets those protection standards pending the court's decision." The kitchen was quiet. Then Ethan said, "What happens if you decide it doesn't?" Janet looked at him. She softened slightly, the professional softness of someone who has learned to modulate. "Then we would need to arrange a certified temporary placement while the guardianship petition moves through the court." Ethan looked at Linda, then at Marcus, then back at Janet. "I'm not going," he said. His voice was quiet and absolute, exactly the same tone he'd used behind the dumpster. "I know you can make me. I know you have the authority. But I'm telling you right now that if you put me somewhere else, I will leave, same as I left everywhere else. And this time I won't stop until you can't find me." He wasn't threatening. He wasn't performing. He was simply reporting a fact about himself with the certainty of someone who has already proven it. "I'm done going to places where I don't choose to be." The kitchen held its breath. Janet Hess looked at this 7-year-old boy with the two old eyes and the flat, steady voice and the hands resting still on the table in front of him. And something happened behind her professional expression, something that looked, just for a second, like recognition. She picked up her clipboard. She wrote something long. She closed it. "I'm going to need to see the house," she said to Linda. "I'll give you the full tour," Linda said. Janet Hess stayed for 2 hours. She went through every room. She checked the smoke detectors and the first aid kit and the sleeping arrangements and the kitchen. She spoke to Linda alone for 30 minutes and to Ethan alone for 20. And Ethan answered her questions with the same careful precision he'd used for everything. Not hiding, not performing, just being exactly as honest as the question required and no more. At the end of the 2 hours, she came back to the kitchen and sat at the table across from Marcus and Linda. And she put her clipboard face down, and she said something that nobody had expected. "I've been doing this job for 11 years, she said, "and I have seen this situation from 100 different angles. A child in unofficial care, a well-meaning adult, concerned parties who believe the system is the enemy." She paused. "The system isn't the enemy. It's just slow and underfunded and operated by humans who make mistakes." She looked at Linda. "Your home is suitable. Your background is clean. Your intention seems genuine." Then she looked at Marcus. "I don't know you. I don't know your organization. What I know is that this boy, who I have been told ran from 4 placements, who has been surviving alone for nearly 2 weeks, is sitting at that kitchen table right now without flinching." She tapped her pen against the table. "That's not nothing." Marcus said nothing. "I'm going to file a recommendation that the current arrangement be maintained pending the court's decision," Janet said. "Not because of the money or the lawyers or the sheriff's letter, because of the child." She looked at Ethan one more time through the kitchen doorway. "He deserves to stop running." After she left, Linda sat down heavily in her kitchen chair and put both hands over her face for a moment. Then she dropped them and said, "I need coffee. Real coffee, not the diner stuff." Marcus said, "I'll make it." Linda looked at him. "You know how to make coffee?" "I've been up for 36 hours, Marcus said. "I can make anything right now." And for just a moment, just a sliver of a moment in the middle of all the paperwork and the fear and the complexity, Linda Brooks laughed, a real laugh. And Ethan, standing in the doorway, having heard all of it, allowed himself the smallest possible smile. The call from Judge Whitmore's clerk came 4 days later. Patricia took it in the diner parking lot, with Marcus standing 3 feet away trying to read her face, and failing completely because Patricia Okafor's face during phone calls was a masterwork of professional opacity. She hung up. She turned to Marcus. "The judge has reviewed the emergency petition, the sheriff's letter, the social worker's recommendation, and the licensing complaint against the 3rd placement. She's also reviewed the video footage." Patricia paused. "She's calling it an expedited hearing. 2 weeks from Thursday. She wants to see Linda, Ethan, Daniel Reeves, and Janet Hess in her courtroom." 2 weeks, Marcus repeated. "For Judge Whitmore, 2 weeks is fast," Patricia said. "Trust me." "And the hearing? What's the likelihood?" Patricia looked at him over her glasses. In 15 years, she had learned exactly when to hedge and when to be direct. If Linda shows up, tells the truth, and Ethan tells the judge what he told Janet Hess, I would be shocked if Carol Whitmore rules any other way. She tucked her phone in her pocket. "But Marcus, I need to tell you something else." "What?" "The clerk mentioned that a family has come forward. From the first placement, the clean one, the one that just felt empty, the couple in Phoenix." She paused. "They've apparently been following Ethan's case through the county system. They want to submit a competing petition for guardianship." Marcus stared at her. "Competing," he repeated. "They have the advantage of being the first placement. The judge will have to consider both." She held his gaze. "I need you to prepare Ethan for the possibility that someone else might speak up for him in that courtroom. And I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that the right answer for Ethan might not be the one that feels right to us." The parking lot was quiet. In the distance, 2 bikes, Marcus's and Lucas's, the only ones left now that the others had finally ridden on. sat side by side near the diner entrance. Marcus looked at them for a long moment. "He told me he wanted to stay," Marcus said. "I know," Patricia said, "and that matters. At 7, the court gives weight to preference but doesn't always follow it." She put a hand briefly on his arm. "Tell him the truth. Let him be prepared. He's handled everything else." Marcus went back inside. He found Ethan in the living room, sitting on the couch with the photograph of his mother in his lap. Just looking at it. Not crying, just looking. The way you look at the only proof you have left that something good was once real. Marcus sat down next to him, not across the room, right next to him. "There's a hearing," Marcus said. "In 2 weeks, a judge is going to decide." Ethan looked up. "Decide what?" "Where you live. Permanently." Ethan looked back at the photograph. "Is Linda going to be there?" "Yes." "Are you going to be there?" Marcus paused. "If you want me there, yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "The first family," he said suddenly, "the couple in Phoenix, they want me too?" Marcus went still. "How did you—" "I heard Patricia on the phone," Ethan said simply. "I hear most things. I got good at it." He turned the photograph over in his hands. "They were nice," he said. "The Phoenix couple. They were just— there was nothing there, nothing warm." He looked at Marcus. "Linda talks to me like I'm a real person. Even when she's strict, she looks at me like I'm a real person." He paused. "The Phoenix house was clean. This house feels like somewhere someone actually lives." Marcus looked at the photograph in Ethan's hands. Claire Walker, laughing on the hood of a red car. "You're going to have to say that to the judge," Marcus said. "I know," Ethan said. "It might not matter. The court might—" "I know," Ethan said again, and the knowing in it was so deep, so practiced, that Marcus felt it like a physical thing. This was a child who had learned over and over that the things you wanted and the things that happened were not always the same, and had built himself around that knowledge so that it wouldn't destroy him. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, kid, you fight for it. You hear me? Whatever they ask you, whatever that courtroom feels like, you say what you told me just now. You say it clear and you say it honest, and you let that judge see exactly who you are." Ethan looked at him. "What if it's not enough?" he asked. "Then we fight the next step," Marcus said. "But let's see what happens when a judge actually hears you." Ethan looked back at his mother's photograph. "She always said someone would come," he said softly. "I used to think she was wrong." He folded the photograph carefully, put it back in his front pocket, stood up. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Marcus confirmed, and Ethan Walker walked back to the kitchen where Linda was making dinner that he had not asked for and did not have to earn, and sat down at the table that was starting, slowly and terrifyingly, and with great care, to feel like it might be his. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the longest of Linda Brooks's life, and she had lived through her husband's death and her son's silence, and 8 years of rattling around a 3-bedroom house alone. So that was saying something. She didn't tell Ethan it was hard. She didn't need to. He already knew. She could see it in the way he watched her face every morning when she came downstairs, reading her the way he read every adult, scanning for information about what the day was going to cost him. So she made sure her face, every single morning, said the same thing. "We're still here. Nothing's changed. You're still safe." It was the most deliberate thing she'd ever done. Ethan, for his part, moved through those 2 weeks the way someone moves through unfamiliar terrain, carefully, attentively, always with one part of himself slightly held back. He ate at her table. He slept in her second bedroom, in a real bed with real sheets that Marcus had driven to a store in Flagstaff to buy, because Linda's spare room had been storage for 8 years and had a fold-out cot that nobody should sleep on permanently. He started answering Linda's questions with more than one sentence. He stopped flinching when she raised her voice at the television during the evening news. But he kept the grocery bag. Linda noticed it on the fourth day, the bag still sitting on the floor of his room near the door, still packed, the same oversized t-shirt and broken flashlight visible through the thin plastic. She didn't say anything about it. She understood. The bag wasn't a plan, it was a reflex. It was the last layer of armor on a boy who had learned the hard way that safety was usually temporary. She let it be. Marcus came by 3 times that first week, always calling ahead, always staying only as long as Ethan seemed comfortable, always bringing something practical. New sneakers the second visit, a library card application the third. Lucas came twice. Ray Kowalski came once with his granddaughter, who was 6 and fearless, and spent 40 minutes teaching Ethan a card game he already knew, but pretended to learn because she was so proud of teaching it. That night, Linda found Ethan at the kitchen table with a small smile still on his face, eating cereal at 8:30, and she thought, there you are. There's the kid underneath all that survival. She didn't say it out loud. She just sat across from him and drank her tea. She cheats, Ethan said. Ray's granddaughter? Yeah, she counts cards. She's 6 and she counts cards. Linda looked at him over her mug. Smart family. Yeah, Ethan said. And then quietly, like he was testing the word, they're nice. They are, Linda said. A pause. Marcus's people, Ethan said. Are they always like that? Like what? He thought about it. Like they decided something and then they just did it. No big discussion, just decided. Linda set her mug down. I think that's how they've always worked, she said. When something matters to them, they move. Ethan looked at his cereal. I matter to them, he said. Not a question. A thing he was still practicing believing. Yeah, Linda said. You do. He nodded once, ate another spoonful. And Linda Brooks, who had told Marcus she was not a warm, fuzzy person, felt something quietly rearrange itself inside her chest that she suspected was not going to rearrange itself back. The morning of the hearing, Ethan woke up at 5:15. Linda heard him moving around and came downstairs to find him already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with his mother's photograph in front of him, not eating, not drinking, just sitting with it the way someone sits with something they need before walking into something hard. Linda made eggs. She put them in front of him. He ate them mechanically. You nervous? She asked. Yes, he said. Honest, same as always. Good, she said. That means you care. Caring is right. He looked up at her. What if the judge picks the Phoenix family? Linda had prepared for this question. She had been preparing for it for 2 weeks, and she had decided that the only acceptable response was the truth. Then we appeal. Patricia has already drafted the appeal paperwork, and you are old enough and clear enough in your own mind that the court will have to take your preference seriously. She sat across from him. But Ethan, I need you to hear me. Whatever happens in that courtroom, you are not going back to a dumpster. You are not going back to a locked door. That part is over, no matter what the judge decides. You understand me? Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his mother's photograph and folded it carefully and put it in his front pocket. Okay, he said. They drove to Phoenix in Linda's truck. Marcus and Lucas followed on their bikes, which Ethan had requested specifically, not because he needed them there exactly, but because having them behind him felt like something structural, something load-bearing. Patricia met them on the courthouse steps. She looked at Ethan, assessed him in 3 seconds the way she assessed everything, and said, You look good. You look like a kid who knows what he wants to say. That's exactly right. She turned and led them inside. Judge Carol Whitmore was 61 years old, gray-haired, and possessed of a courtroom presence that made the air feel slightly more serious than usual. She had been a family court judge for 19 years. She had seen every variety of difficult custody and guardianship situation the state of Arizona could produce. And she had developed, over those 19 years, the ability to read a room and a child very quickly. She read Ethan Walker in about 90 seconds. He sat in a chair to Patricia's left, in a blue button-down shirt Linda had bought him 3 days ago, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his face carefully composed but his eyes moving, taking in the room, cataloging the judge, the representatives from the Phoenix couple seated on the opposite side, the social worker Janet Hess in the second row, Daniel Reeves behind her in his uniform. Judge Whitmore looked at him for a long moment before she began. Then she looked at the Phoenix couple. They were a decent pair, Gerald and Susan Marsh, late 50s, clean record, solid home, genuine in their interest. Their attorney made a composed, thorough case. First placement, established relationship, stable environment, financial security. It was a good case. Patricia had warned Marcus it would be. Then Patricia stood up for Linda. She spoke for 11 minutes. She spoke about the emergency guardianship process, the social worker's recommendation, the sheriff's letter, the community support. She spoke about Linda's home and Linda's history and Linda's character. Then she sat down. Judge Whitmore looked over her glasses at Ethan. "Ethan," she said. Her voice was direct but not unkind. "I'd like to hear from you, not through your attorney, from you." She leaned forward slightly. "Can you tell me, in your own words, where you want to live and why?" The courtroom was completely silent. Ethan looked at the judge. He didn't look at Linda. He didn't look at Marcus, who was in the gallery behind the railing. He looked directly at the judge, the way he had looked at everyone who had asked him something real. Straight on, no performance, just the plain truth of him. "I want to stay with Linda," he said, "because she treats me like I'm a real person, not a situation that needs to be managed. And because she didn't offer me her house because it looked good on paper. She offered it because she was angry that I'd been sleeping behind her dumpster, and she wasn't going to let that keep being true." He paused. "The Marsh family are good people. I believe that. But I was in their house for 6 weeks, and nobody ever asked me a single question about myself. Not one." Another pause. "Linda asked me my favorite food the first morning. It sounds small. It's not small." Judge Whitmore looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You're right, it's not small." She looked down at her papers, wrote something, looked up again. "Ethan, one more question. The grocery bag your caseworker mentioned, are you still keeping it packed?" The courtroom stirred slightly. Ethan blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at his hands, then back at her. "Because every time before, when I let myself believe somewhere was home, it stopped being home before I was ready." He looked at her steadily. "I keep it packed so that when it happens again, it doesn't break me as bad." The judge was quiet. "What would it take," she said carefully, "for you to unpack it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He sat with the question the way he sat with all serious questions, fully, without rushing. "Knowing I don't have to pack it," he said finally. Judge Carol Whitmore, who had not visibly shown emotion in a courtroom in 11 years, took a single, slow breath. Then she picked up her pen and wrote for 45 seconds straight without looking up. She ruled from the bench. Emergency guardianship granted to Linda Brooks, effective immediately, with a pathway to permanent guardianship hearing in 60 days, contingent on continued satisfactory placement. The Phoenix family's petition was denied without prejudice, meaning Gerald and Susan Marsh were decent people who had done nothing wrong and were acknowledged as such. Daniel Reeves' letter was entered into the permanent record. Janet Hess's recommendation was cited specifically. Patricia reached over and squeezed Linda's hand. Linda didn't make a sound. She just closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and looked at Ethan. He was looking back at her. His jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and he was doing the thing he always did, working very hard at something that he was very close to losing control of. "Okay," he said. His voice was barely there. "Okay," Linda said back. Behind the railing, Marcus Hayes put one hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. Lucas stood next to him with his arms crossed and his eyes closed and every muscle in his face doing something he wasn't going to explain to anyone. Ray Kowalski, who had driven 4 hours to be in the gallery, turned to the man beside him and said absolutely nothing because he couldn't. They drove back to Ridgeline in the afternoon. When they pulled up to the house, there were 11 motorcycles parked along the road. Not 500, just the ones who lived close enough to come on short notice. The ones Marcus had quietly told that morning, just in case. They stood in the yard, not making noise, not celebrating loudly, because they understood instinctively that this moment did not belong to them. It belonged to the boy getting out of Linda's truck. Ethan looked at the bikes, looked at the men, looked at the house. Marcus came up beside him. "How you feeling?" Marcus asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he walked inside, through the front room, down the hallway, into his bedroom. Marcus followed him to the doorway and stopped. Ethan stood next to his bed. He looked at the grocery bag on the floor by the door. He picked it up. He stood there with it for a moment, the worn plastic handles in his hands, the broken flashlight inside, the oversized t-shirt his mother had bought him at a gas station the summer before everything ended. Then he put it in the closet. He didn't unpack it, not yet. That would take more time, and that was okay, because time was the one thing he finally had enough of. But he put it in the closet, and he closed the closet door, and he stood there with his hand flat against the door and breathed. Marcus watched from the doorway without saying a word. Then Ethan turned around. He reached into the front pocket of his jeans and took out his mother's photograph. He looked at it for a long moment, Claire Walker on the hood of that red car, laughing at something beautiful and just out of frame. He walked to the dresser. He set the photograph against the mirror, facing out, so she could see the room. So she could see that her promise had kept, that somebody had come, that her boy had finally stopped running. Marcus stood in the doorway of that bedroom and felt something move through him that had nothing to do with the road or the brotherhood or 30 years of living hard. He thought about his own son, the number he hadn't dialed in 15 years, still in his phone, still possible. He thought about what a whisper could cost you if you were the one who didn't stop to hear it. He pulled out his phone. He found the number. He pressed call. It rang twice. A man's voice answered, younger than Marcus remembered, steadier, but unmistakably his. "Dad?" Marcus closed his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "It's me." A pause. "I know it's been a long time. I wanted to hear your voice." Down the hall, Linda was making dinner. Outside, 11 bikers were climbing back onto their bikes one by one, heading home to their own lives, their own families, their own versions of the things that mattered. In his bedroom, Ethan Walker stood at his dresser and looked at his mother's photograph and let himself, for the first time in a very long time, simply exist in a place without calculating the exit. He was 7 years old. He had a home. He had a woman downstairs who asked about his favorite food and meant it. He had a brotherhood that had heard a whisper from a dark corner of the Arizona desert and had answered it with everything they had. And he had his mother's laugh on his dresser, watching over a room that was finally, completely, unreservedly his. Some things break you open just enough to let something permanent grow in. Ethan Walker was proof of that. And so was every man who had stopped his bike that night, not because it was convenient, not because it was safe, not because the world would understand, but because a small boy had asked only to be left alone, and they had recognized in that whisper the sound of someone who deserves so much more than silence. They gave him the only thing that ever really mattered. They stayed.